He handed me a number card like I was a coat check ticket, then walked back to the microphone and told 300 of the wealthiest people in the state that his wife was, in his words, surplus to requirements. I stood on that small stage in the dress he'd picked out for me, and I heard him say the opening bid was $10, not 20, 10. Someone laughed before he even finished the sentence, because that's how confident he was that no one would take this seriously, that it was just a joke at his own gala. A little roast for the crowd before dessert was served. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. I did not cry. I did not run off that stage. I stood there in silence, and I let him finish his joke because I already knew something he didn't. 3 weeks earlier, my father's attorney had called me with news my husband was never supposed to hear before the reading of the will. My father, a man my husband had always treated like an inconvenient relative who took too long to die, had left behind considerably more than anyone in that ballroom suspected, and he'd left almost none of it to me directly. He'd left it to a trust, controlled by a single trustee, with one condition attached that nobody but the attorney and I knew about yet. So when my husband stood at that podium and joked that his wife wasn't worth more than the price of a parking ticket, he had no idea that the person he was mocking held a card that could unmake his entire social empire in one afternoon. The bidding started exactly the way he wanted it to. A friend of his, one of the golf buddies, called out $15 just to keep the joke rolling, and the room laughed harder. My husband grinned like he'd just landed the punchline of the year. He looked so pleased with himself standing up there, tuxedo pressed, champagne in hand, completely unaware that the ground under his shoes was already cracking. I scanned the crowd from the stage, and that's when I saw a man near the back doors who hadn't laughed once. Gray suit, no drink in his hand, watching everything with the stillness of someone who wasn't at this party to socialize. $20, someone else called out, and my husband banged an imaginary gavel and said sold, going once. That's when the man in the gray suit stepped forward, and the room went quiet in that particular way. A room goes quiet when it senses something it doesn't understand yet. He didn't raise a paddle. He raised his voice instead, calm and clear, and said, $2 million. Not as a joke, not with a smile. He said it the way you'd read a number off a legal document, because that's exactly what he was doing. My husband's grin didn't fade slowly. It vanished in an instant, like someone had cut the power to his face. $2 million for a joke auction was not a punchline anyone in that room knew how to laugh at, and the silence that followed was so complete I could hear the ice shifting in someone's glass 3 tables away. He looked at the man, then he looked at me, and for the first time in 11 years of marriage, I watched genuine confusion cross my husband's face, the kind of confusion that comes from realizing you don't actually know the woman standing next to you. The man in the gray suit walked to the base of the stage and introduced himself, not to me, but to the room, because he understood exactly what kind of moment this was and exactly how to use it. He said his name was Elliot Marsh, and that he was the estate attorney for my late father, and that he was here tonight, at this specific gala, because the will required a public reading within 30 days of a certain condition being triggered, and that condition had just been triggered 30 seconds ago when my husband auctioned me off in front of witnesses. My husband started to say something. Some version of it was just a joke, but Elliot held up a single folded document and asked if he could read one paragraph aloud, and my husband, still holding his champagne like a prop he'd forgotten was in his hand, said nothing at all. The paragraph Elliot read explained that my father had structured his entire estate around a clause his lawyers called the dignity provision, something he'd insisted on after watching, in his final years, exactly how my husband spoke to me at family dinners, exactly how he introduced me at events, exactly how small he liked to make me feel in rooms full of people who mattered to him. The trust would remain locked and untouchable unless a specific, verifiable act of public humiliation occurred, at which point full control transferred immediately and irrevocably to me and me alone. My father hadn't guessed this might happen. He had built a legal mechanism betting on it. I watched my husband do the math in real time. His golf buddies, his business partners, his mother, seated at table 4, hand over her mouth. Every person he needed to believe in his image of himself as a generous, charming, successful man was standing in that room watching a lawyer explain that my father had specifically engineered a trap for the exact moment my husband would inevitably embarrass me in public, because he knew, better than anyone, that it wasn't a matter of if, only when. He tried to recover. He always tried to recover. That was his particular skill. Turning any room back in his favor with a joke or a compliment or a well-timed toast. He laughed, too loud, and said something about how these lawyers really know how to turn a party into a courtroom, and he reached for my hand like we were going to laugh about this together later. I didn't take it. I stayed exactly where I was, under that spotlight, in the dress he'd chosen for me, and I let 300 people watch him reach for a hand that wasn't going to be given. Elliot continued, because there was more, and this was the part I hadn't even been told until that morning. The trust didn't just include my father's assets. It included, per a separate agreement my father had negotiated 18 months earlier, the controlling shares in the company my husband worked for, shares my father had quietly acquired specifically to have leverage over the one person who could never know he had it until it mattered. My husband's employer wasn't just his employer anymore. As of that reading, it answered to me. The room didn't gasp, not in the movie way people imagine. It did something quieter and more devastating, a kind of collective recalculation. 300 people simultaneously updating who held power in that marriage, in that career, in that room. His business partner, a man who'd spent the whole night laughing at every joke my husband made, was suddenly very interested in his phone. His mother stood up from table 4 and walked toward the stage, not toward her son, toward me. My husband finally said my name, quietly this time, the way he used to say it in the early years before he decided I was something to perform confidence at, rather than someone to actually see. I looked at him for a long moment, and I thought about every dinner party where he'd introduced me as just my wife, every anniversary he'd forgotten, every time he'd made himself the main character of a life I'd spent a decade building beside him. And then I looked past him, to Elliot, and I asked one question that ended up mattering more than anything else said that night. I asked whether the transfer was immediate. It was. Elliot confirmed the paperwork had already been filed that morning, contingent only on tonight's event. An event my husband had walked into eyes wide open and staged himself, standing at a podium, joking about a number that would end up costing him everything he thought he owned. I took the microphone from the auctioneer's stand, and for the first time all night, the room was silent because they wanted to hear what I would say, not because they were embarrassed for me. I told them the auction was over, and that the winning bid, as it turned out, had already been paid in full, 11 years ago, the day I said yes to a man who never once imagined the cost of underestimating the person standing next to him. Then I stepped off that stage, past my husband, past the golf buddies, past the mother who reached for my hand instead of her son's, and I walked out into a night that belonged, as of 30 seconds prior, entirely to me.